The morning sun cast long shadows across the military briefing room as Professor Marcus Chen adjusted his glasses nervously. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the classified file folder that would change everything. Around the table sat 12 of the most decorated military officers in the country, their faces grim with anticipation. What they were about to hear would challenge everything they thought they knew about warfare. "Gentlemen," Professor Chen began, his voice barely above a whisper, "what I'm about to show you has been classified for the past 6 months. The situation we're facing is unlike anything in modern military history." He clicked a remote, and the wall screen illuminated with satellite imagery of a mountainous region that looked like something from another planet. The images showed a fortress carved directly into the mountainside, its black stone walls rising like jagged teeth against the sky. Multiple defensive positions dotted the landscape, each one strategically placed to create overlapping fields of fire. Guard towers stretched impossibly high, their searchlights creating a web of surveillance that seemed to cover every inch of the surrounding terrain. "This is Fortress Mordain," Chen continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject. "Located in the remote mountains of Eastern Europe, it has been the stronghold of Viktor Kozlov and his private army for the past 3 years. Intelligence suggests that Kozlov has been developing and testing weapons that violate every international treaty we've ever signed." Colonel James Harrison, a man whose chest was covered with ribbons from 3 different wars, leaned forward in his chair. "Professor, with all due respect, fortresses can be taken. We've done it before. What makes this one so special?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Chen's face paled as he clicked to the next slide. What appeared on screen made several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was a list of military operations, each one marked with a red stamp that simply read, "Failed." "In the past 2 years," Chen said slowly, 12 different military forces have attempted to breach this fortress. The British sent their Special Air Service. The French deployed their Foreign Legion. The Russians tried twice with their Spetsnaz units. The Americans sent Delta Force, and the Israelis attempted it with their most elite commandos. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Outside, birds chirped innocently, unaware of the gravity of what was being discussed just meters away. "Each mission resulted in complete failure," Chen continued. "But failure doesn't begin to describe what happened to these soldiers. Out of approximately 10,000 highly trained Special Forces operatives who attempted to infiltrate or assault this fortress, exactly 17 returned alive. 17 out of 10,000. The number hit the room like a physical blow. General Patricia Morrison, a woman who had commanded troops in some of the most dangerous conflicts of the past decade, felt her stomach tighten. She had seen battlefield casualties before, but nothing approaching this scale of devastation. "How?" she asked simply. Chen clicked to another slide showing architectural blueprints that looked more like the plans for a deadly maze than a military installation. "Kozlov isn't just a warlord," he explained. "He holds 3 doctoral degrees in military engineering, psychology, and chemical warfare. This fortress isn't just defended, it's designed specifically to kill anyone who tries to enter it." The blueprints revealed a nightmare of military engineering. Corridors that led to dead ends filled with poison gas. False floors that dropped intruders into pits lined with spikes. Motion sensors connected to automated weapons systems. Pressure plates that triggered explosives powerful enough to collapse entire sections of tunnel. "The outer defenses alone have claimed thousands of lives," Chen said, pointing to various sections of the blueprint. "Here we have anti-personnel mines that are nearly impossible to detect. Here are automated sentry guns with thermal imaging that can target anything moving within a 2-mile radius. And, here," he pointed to what looked like innocent guard towers, "are electromagnetic pulse generators that disable all electronic equipment within a half-mile radius." Major David Kim, a demolitions expert who had survived some of the most dangerous bomb disposal operations in recent memory, studied the blueprints with growing unease. "Professor, this isn't a fortress. This is a death trap designed by someone who understands exactly how military forces operate." "Precisely," Chen nodded. "But it gets worse. Intelligence suggests that Kozlov has been studying the tactics and equipment of every force that has attempted to breach his defenses. Each failed mission has only made him stronger and his fortress more deadly. The professor clicked to a new slide showing photographs that made several officers look away. Bodies in various military uniforms lay scattered across a rocky landscape, their equipment destroyed, their weapons useless. Some appeared to have been killed by conventional weapons, but others showed signs of more exotic deaths. "Chemical weapons?" asked Colonel Harrison, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Among other things," Chen replied grimly. "Kozlov has access to nerve agents that are banned under international law. He has sonic weapons that can rupture internal organs from a distance. He even has experimental directed energy weapons that can cook a human being from the inside out." The room's atmosphere grew heavier with each revelation. These were soldiers who had faced death many times, but the calculated cruelty of what they were hearing went beyond normal warfare into something approaching pure evil. "What does he want?" General Morrison asked. Chen's expression darkened further. "Power. Money. But, mostly, he wants to prove that conventional military forces are obsolete. Every failed mission validates his belief that he's created something unstoppable. Intelligence suggests he's planning to sell his defensive technologies to the highest bidder, potentially changing the nature of warfare forever." "We can't let that happen," Colonel Harrison said firmly. "Which brings us to why you're all here," Chen said, clicking to a new slide that showed nothing but a single question mark. "The Pentagon has asked me to brief you on this situation because they want to know if there's any military solution to the Kozlov problem." The question hung in the air like a challenge. These were some of the most experienced military minds in the country, people who had planned and executed operations that seemed impossible. But the scale of the casualties they were discussing was beyond anything in their experience. "What about airstrikes?" Major Kim suggested. "Bunker busters could crack that mountain open." Chen shook his head. "The fortress is built inside a natural cave system that extends for miles underground. Kozlov has multiple escape routes and enough supplies to last for years. Bombing would only seal him in temporarily, and he'd emerge stronger when the dust settled." "Siege warfare?" General Morrison offered. "He has his own water supply from underground springs and enough food to last a decade. A siege would only give him more time to develop new weapons and defensive systems." One by one, conventional military options were discussed and dismissed. The fortress seemed to have been designed to counter every possible approach that a traditional military force might take. It was as if Kozlov had studied military history and, then, created something specifically designed to make that history irrelevant. The briefing continued for 3 hours, with Chen presenting detail after detail about failed operations and impossible defenses. By the time he finished, the room felt like a morgue. These were people accustomed to finding solutions to military problems, but Fortress Mordain seemed to defy every principle of warfare they understood. "So what you're telling us," General Morrison said slowly, "is that this fortress is essentially impregnable." "That's correct," Chen replied. "Every military analysis we've conducted reaches the same conclusion. Fortress Mordain cannot be taken by conventional forces, no matter how large or how well equipped." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of papers rustling as officers reviewed their notes. The weight of 10,000 casualties hung over the room like a dark cloud. These weren't just numbers on a page, they represented thousands of families who had lost loved ones to Kozlov's mechanical cruelty. "There has to be something," Colonel Harrison muttered, more to himself than to the room. "Some weakness we're not seeing." Chen nodded sympathetically. "Believe me, Colonel, we've looked. We've had our best minds studying this problem for months. Computer simulations, war games, theoretical models, everything comes back to the same conclusion. The fortress is simply too well defended and too well designed." As the briefing concluded and officers began filing out of the room, each one carried with them the sobering knowledge that somewhere in the mountains of Eastern Europe stood a fortress that had made conventional warfare obsolete. The implications were staggering. If Kozlov succeeded in selling his defensive technologies, conflicts around the world would become exponentially more deadly. But, unknown to everyone in that room, 50 miles away in a small military training facility, someone was listening to a completely different kind of briefing. Someone who would hear about the 10,000 dead soldiers and respond in a way that no military planner had anticipated. Someone who would look at the impossible fortress and simply say, "Hold my beer." The stage was set for a confrontation that would rewrite the rules of warfare itself. But, first, the world would need to meet the most unlikely hero in military history, a person whose approach to the impossible would make even seasoned veterans question everything they thought they knew about courage, strategy, and the limits of human determination. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, Viktor Kozlov continued his work, confident that his fortress was untouchable. He had no way of knowing that his greatest challenge was about to come from a direction he had never considered, from someone who would approach his deadly maze with tactics that defied every principle of military science. The morning sun continued to cast its long shadows across the briefing room, but somewhere in its light was the beginning of a story that would become legend. Staff Sergeant Jake Martinez had never been the kind of soldier who drew attention to himself. At 5 feet 8 inches tall with an unremarkable build, he looked more like an accountant than a special forces operative. His brown hair was always perfectly regulation, his uniform always properly pressed, and his manner always respectfully quiet. In 15 years of military service, he had never once been written up for insubordination, never caused trouble, and never volunteered for anything that wasn't directly assigned to him. Which made what happened next all the more surprising. Martinez was cleaning his rifle in the armory when Lieutenant Sarah Chen burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and anger. She had just come from the same briefing that had left 12 senior officers feeling defeated, and the weight of what she had learned was burning inside her like acid. "Can you believe this?" she said, throwing her briefing folder onto the workbench with enough force to make several cleaning rods jump. 10,000 soldiers dead, and the best minds in the military are ready to give up. Martinez continued cleaning his weapon with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire military career. He had learned long ago that when officers were upset, the best policy was to listen quietly and avoid offering opinions unless directly asked. "They're talking about declaring the fortress untouchable," Chen continued, pacing back and forth across the small armory. "They want to recommend that we just monitor the situation and hope Kozlov doesn't decide to export his technology." Monitor. Like we're talking about a weather pattern instead of a madman who's killed 10,000 of our people. She stopped pacing and looked directly at Martinez. "What do you think, Jake? Should we just accept that there are places our military can't go?" Martinez paused in his cleaning and looked up at the lieutenant. Sarah Chen was one of the few officers he genuinely respected. She had come up through the ranks, earned her commission in the field, and never asked her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do herself. If she was asking for his opinion, she genuinely wanted to hear it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think sometimes the best solution isn't the obvious one." "What do you mean?" Martinez set down his cleaning rod and thought for a moment. "Well, from what you've told me, this Kozlov character has spent years studying how military forces operate. He's designed his defenses specifically to counter large-scale operations with advanced equipment and coordinated tactics." "Right. That's exactly the problem." "But, ma'am," Martinez said slowly, "what if someone didn't use large-scale operations? What if someone didn't bring advanced equipment? What if instead of coordinated tactics, someone just improvised?" Lieutenant Chen stared at him for a long moment. "Jake, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm just saying that sometimes when you can't go through something, around something, over something, or under something, maybe you have to go at it sideways." What happened next would be discussed in military academies for decades to come. Lieutenant Chen, instead of dismissing her sergeant's comment as the idle speculation of an enlisted man, sat down across from him and said, "Tell me more." Martinez felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. He wasn't used to officers taking his ideas seriously, and he certainly wasn't used to discussing strategy above his pay grade. But there was something about the way Chen was looking at him that made him feel like his thoughts actually mattered. "Well, ma'am, from what you've described, this fortress is designed to handle everything from stealth infiltration to full-scale assault. It has countermeasures for every type of advanced military technology. It's been built by someone who understands exactly how modern armies think and fight. So how do you beat that?" Martinez picked up his rifle and held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight. You don't fight like a modern army. You fight like someone this guy has never studied. You fight like someone who doesn't have access to advanced technology. You fight like someone who's too ignorant to know what's impossible. The idea was so simple it was almost insulting. After months of complex analysis and sophisticated planning, a staff sergeant was suggesting that the solution to an impossible military problem was to be deliberately primitive and unsophisticated. Jake, Chen said carefully, are you volunteering for a suicide mission? No, ma'am. I'm volunteering for a mission everyone thinks is suicide but might not be. The distinction was important, though neither of them fully understood why at the time. Martinez wasn't driven by a death wish or a desire for glory. He was driven by something much simpler, the absolute conviction that 10,000 dead soldiers deserved better than surrender. Even if I wanted to approve something like this, Chen said, which I'm not saying I do, there's no way the brass would sign off on a solo infiltration mission. Especially not after what happened to Delta Force. Ma'am, what if they didn't know about it? The suggestion hung in the air between them like a live grenade. What Martinez was proposing wasn't just militarily unconventional, it was technically insubordination of the highest order. A soldier couldn't just decide to undertake a classified mission without authorization, no matter how noble his intentions. But Lieutenant Chen found herself thinking about the faces of the officers she had seen leaving that briefing room. 12 of the most experienced military minds in the country, and every one of them had looked defeated. She thought about the photographs Professor Chen had shown them, bodies scattered across a foreign mountainside, soldiers who had died believing they were part of something important. This is crazy, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am, it is. You could be court-martialed. Yes, ma'am, I could. You could die horribly in a fortress designed specifically to kill people like you. Yes, ma'am, that's possible too. Chen studied Martinez's face for a long moment. In 15 years of working together, she had never seen him show anything but calm professionalism. But now there was something different in his eyes, not excitement or bloodlust, but a quiet determination that seemed unshakable. Why? She asked simply. Martinez was quiet for a long time before answering. My brother was a Marine, ma'am. He died in Afghanistan in 2018. Not in some dramatic firefight or heroic last stand. He stepped on an IED while trying to deliver medical supplies to a village school. Just gone. Chen nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. When I got the news, Martinez continued, I kept thinking about how his death wasn't supposed to mean anything. There was no victory, no strategic objective achieved. He just died because sometimes good people die in bad places. But, you know what I realized? What? His death meant everything, because he was trying to help people who needed help. And now we have 10,000 soldiers who died trying to stop something evil, and their deaths won't mean anything if we just give up. The armory fell silent except for the distant sound of soldiers drilling in the courtyard outside. Chen found herself thinking about her own military career, about all the times she had been told something was impossible only to watch someone find a way to make it possible. Even if I wanted to help you, she said finally, I couldn't provide any official support. No equipment requisitions, no transportation, no backup. You'd be completely on your own. I understand, ma'am. And if you got caught, I'd have to deny any knowledge of your plans. I understand that too. Chen stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the training grounds. Young soldiers were practicing formation drills, their movements precise and coordinated. They looked so confident, so sure that their training and equipment would be enough to overcome any challenge they might face. Those Delta Force operators who died, she said without turning around. They were the best soldiers we had. Better trained, better equipped, and better prepared than you could ever be. Yes, ma'am, they were. So what makes you think you can succeed where they failed? Martinez stood up and began reassembling his rifle with the same methodical precision he had used to clean it. Because they were trying to be the best soldiers we had. I'm just trying to be a soldier this Kozlov guy has never seen before. It was then that Chen realized what Martinez was really proposing. Every military force that had attacked the fortress had done so using the same basic principles: superior training, advanced equipment, coordinated tactics, and overwhelming force. Kozlov had studied these principles and built his defenses specifically to counter them. But Martinez was suggesting something different. He was proposing to approach the fortress not as a sophisticated military operation but as something much more primitive. Like a single person with basic equipment and no plan beyond getting inside and causing as much damage as possible. "You're talking about going back to basics," Chen said slowly. "Not World War II basics. Stone Age basics." "Something like that, ma'am." The more Chen thought about it, the more sense it made in a completely insane way. Kozlov's fortress was designed to defeat modern military forces using modern military tactics. But what if someone approached it using tactics that were older than civilization itself? What if someone treated it not as a sophisticated defensive installation but as simply a cave that needed to be entered? "How would you even get there?" she asked. "Commercial flight to Prague, train to Bratislava, hitchhike into the mountains." Kozlov's intelligence network is looking for military transport and classified movement. They're not watching for a staff sergeant on vacation. Equipment? Whatever I can buy in local stores or make myself. Nothing that would register on any military inventory system. Communications? None. Once I'm in the area, I'm completely dark until the mission is over. Chen turned back to face him. "Jake, what you're describing isn't a military operation. It's barely even organized violence. You're talking about walking into the most heavily defended fortress in the world with equipment you bought at a hardware store." "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what I'm talking about." The simplicity of it was breathtaking. After months of complex planning and sophisticated analysis, the solution might be to send one person with a backpack full of basic supplies to do what 10,000 elite soldiers had failed to accomplish. But there was one more question that needed to be answered. "Jake," Chen said quietly, "what makes you think you can actually get inside that fortress?" Martinez smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. It was a quiet smile, the kind that suggested he knew something nobody else had figured out yet. "Because, ma'am, I don't think like a soldier. I think like a maintenance worker." And, with that simple statement, the most unlikely military mission in modern history began to take shape. Neither Chen nor Martinez realized it at the time, but they had just initiated a chain of events that would challenge every assumption about warfare, strategy, and the limits of human determination. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, Viktor Kozlov continued to refine his defenses, confident that his fortress remained untouchable. He had no way of knowing that his greatest threat was about to come not from elite commandos with advanced weapons, but from a single staff sergeant with a toolbox and an unshakable belief that every fortress, no matter how sophisticated, was still just a building that needed to be maintained by somebody. 3 weeks later, Jake Martinez stepped off a bus in the small mountain village of Krasno, Slovakia, looking exactly like what he was pretending to be, an American tourist on a budget hiking trip. His backpack was filled with camping gear purchased from 3 different sporting goods stores in Prague. His clothes were worn and practical. His boots were broken in but not military issue. To anyone watching, he was just another wanderer exploring the remote corners of Eastern Europe. But Martinez wasn't just any tourist. Hidden among his camping supplies were tools and materials that no sporting goods store had sold him. Wire cutters disguised as tent stakes. Plastic explosives molded to look like energy bars. A small radio transmitter built into what appeared to be a portable camping stove. Each item had been carefully crafted during late nights in his garage, using techniques he had learned not in military training but from 15 years of maintaining equipment in some of the harshest environments on Earth. The village of Krasno sat in a valley 15 miles from Fortress Mordain, close enough to serve as a staging area but far enough away to avoid Kozlov's immediate security perimeter. Martinez had chosen it carefully after studying satellite imagery and local maps. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed but not necessarily reported, where someone could stay for a few days without raising suspicions. He checked into a small inn run by an elderly woman named Elena Novakova, who spoke broken English and seemed delighted to have an American guest. Her enthusiasm was both helpful and concerning. Martinez needed to blend in, but Elena's attention meant he would be remembered if anyone came asking questions later.
"You are here for hiking?" Elena asked as she showed him to a small room on the second floor.
Yes, Martinez replied, maintaining the slightly awkward smile of a tourist trying to communicate across a language barrier. "I love mountains. Very beautiful here."
"Ah yes, beautiful but dangerous."
"You must be careful.
Strange things happen in mountains sometimes."
The warning sent a chill down Martinez's spine.
Elena's tone suggested she knew more about the strange things than she was willing to say directly.
In a village this close to Kozlov's fortress, the locals would certainly be aware that something ominous was happening in their mountains. "What kind of strange things?" he asked, trying to sound like a curious tourist rather than a soldier gathering intelligence.
Elena's expression darkened. "Sometimes we hear noises at night.
Like thunder, but no storms. Sometimes we see lights in places where no lights should be.
And, sometimes."
She paused, looking around as if someone might be listening. "Sometimes people go into mountains and never come back."
Martinez nodded sympathetically while his mind catalogued every detail. The noises Elena described could be weapons testing. The lights might be from Kozlov's defensive systems.
And the missing people were probably scouts or hunters who had wandered too close to the fortress perimeter. That evening, Martinez sat in the inn's small restaurant, eating a surprisingly good goulash while studying topographic maps he had purchased in Prague. To anyone watching, he appeared to be planning hiking routes, but his real focus was on identifying approach vectors to Fortress Mordain that might avoid the most obvious defensive positions. The challenge was significant. Kozlov had chosen his location brilliantly. The fortress sat on a high plateau surrounded by steep cliffs on three sides, with only one practical approach route that was heavily fortified.
Traditional military thinking would focus on that single approach, trying to find ways to overcome or bypass the defenses.
But Martinez wasn't thinking like a traditional military force. He was thinking like someone who needed to service equipment in an inconvenient location. Every fortress, no matter how sophisticated, required utilities.
Power lines to bring in electricity.
Water pipes to supply drinking water and cooling systems.
Sewage lines to remove waste.
Ventilation shafts to provide fresh air to underground areas. And, most importantly, access routes for the people who maintain all of these systems.
Kozlov's security would certainly monitor the obvious routes that maintenance personnel might use.
But Martinez was betting that even the most paranoid warlord would have blind spots in his surveillance network, places where routine maintenance was so mundane that it didn't warrant special attention. Over the next 2 days, Martinez explored the mountains around Krasno, ostensibly taking photographs and enjoying nature hikes. In reality, he was conducting a detailed reconnaissance of the area between the village and the fortress. He identified 6 different utility lines that ran toward the plateau where Kozlov had built his stronghold, power cables strung between tall towers, a water pipeline that followed a natural depression in the landscape, and what appeared to be a communications cable buried alongside a mountain road. More importantly, he began to understand the rhythm of maintenance activity in the area.
Twice a day, small trucks drove along the mountain roads, stopping periodically to check equipment or clear obstacles.
The drivers wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision, clearly Kozlov's people, but trying to maintain the appearance of routine utility work. On his 3rd day in Krasno, Martinez made his move. He waited until late afternoon, when the daily maintenance runs had finished, then hiked to a point where the main power line crossed a narrow mountain valley. The transmission towers here were older and more weathered than the ones closer to the fortress, suggesting they were part of the original infrastructure rather than Kozlov's recent additions. Martinez had spent his entire military career working with electrical systems, and he knew that power lines required constant maintenance.
Insulators needed to be cleaned. Connections needed to be tightened. Wildlife damage needed to be repaired.
It was exactly the kind of routine work that security forces learned to ignore. Using tools from his backpack, he created what appeared to be a routine maintenance problem. A few loosened connections, some debris strategically placed on insulators, and minor damage to a guy wire that would cause the tower to sway slightly in the wind. Nothing dramatic enough to cause a power outage, but enough to require a maintenance visit within the next day or two. Then, he retreated to a concealed observation point and waited.
The response came 18 hours later.
A small truck with utility company markings drove to the base of the damaged tower, and 2 men got out to assess the situation. They moved efficiently but casually, clearly familiar with this type of repair work. One man began climbing the tower while the other organized tools from the truck. Martinez watched through binoculars as the climber inspected the damage he had created. The man's movements were professional and confident. This was clearly someone who performed this type of work regularly. More importantly, neither man seemed particularly concerned about security. They were focused entirely on their technical work. After 20 minutes, the climber descended and both men got back in their truck. But, instead of driving back toward the fortress, they headed down the mountain toward the main road. Martinez realized they were probably returning to get additional parts or equipment needed for the repair. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Moving quickly but carefully, Martinez hiked to the base of the transmission tower and began his own climb. His military training had included extensive work with electrical systems, but, more importantly, his years of maintenance experience had taught him to move confidently in industrial environments. He climbed the tower not like a soldier infiltrating enemy territory, but like a technician doing routine work. At the top of the tower, Martinez could see across the entire valley to where Fortress Mordain rose from its plateau like a black tooth against the sky. From this distance, the fortress looked smaller and less imposing than in the satellite photographs, but he could clearly see the defensive positions that had claimed so many lives. More importantly, he could see the power lines that connected this tower to the fortress itself. High-voltage transmission lines were supported by massive towers spaced roughly half a mile apart. Between the tower where Martinez stood and the fortress, he counted 8 more towers following the natural contours of the mountain terrain. Each tower was equipped with aircraft warning lights and lightning protection systems that would require periodic inspection and maintenance. But what made Martinez's pulse quicken was the realization that the power line route took a completely different path from any of the approaches that previous military forces had attempted. The transmission corridor followed a series of ridges and valleys that would keep someone moving along the lines largely invisible from the fortress's main defensive positions. Martinez spent the next hour studying the route in detail, identifying potential problems and planning solutions. The distance from tower to tower would require careful timing. Too fast and he might encounter maintenance crews; too slow and he would be exposed during daylight hours. The towers themselves would provide rest points and concealment, but only if he could access them without being detected by any monitoring systems. As the afternoon sun began to set, Martinez climbed down from the tower and hiked back toward Krasno. His mind was racing with possibilities and calculations. The approach he was considering was dangerous beyond anything he had attempted in his military career, but it offered something that no previous assault on Fortress Mordain had possessed: the element of complete surprise. Kozlov's defenses were designed to detect and destroy military forces using traditional assault tactics. But they weren't necessarily designed to notice a single person moving slowly along utility corridors, especially if that person moved like a maintenance worker rather than a soldier. That evening, Martinez sat in his small room at the inn, making final preparations for what he knew would likely be a one-way journey. He wrote a letter to his sister, telling her he loved her and asking her to take care of their mother. He wrote another letter to Lieutenant Chen, thanking her for believing in him and asking her to ensure that the families of the 10,000 dead soldiers knew that their sacrifice had not been forgotten. Then, he destroyed both letters. If his mission succeeded, there would be time for proper communications later. If it failed, he didn't want to leave any evidence that might implicate Chen or endanger the villagers who had unknowingly helped him. As midnight approached, Martinez shouldered his backpack and slipped out of the inn through a back window. Elena Novakova never knew that her American guest had left, and she never learned why he never returned to collect his belongings. The most unlikely military infiltration in modern history had begun. A single staff sergeant with a backpack full of improvised equipment was about to attempt what 10,000 elite soldiers had failed to accomplish. He was walking into a fortress that had been specifically designed to kill people like him, armed with nothing more sophisticated than wire cutters, plastic explosives, and an unshakable belief that every complex system had simple vulnerabilities. Behind him, the village of Krasno slept peacefully, unaware that history was being made in their mountains. Ahead of him, Fortress Mordain waited in the darkness, its automated defenses scanning for threats that looked like armies and, missing the single figure moving through the shadows like a man who had every right to be there. In a few hours, Viktor Kozlov would discover that his greatest mistake had been believing that sophisticated defenses required sophisticated attacks to defeat them. Sometimes the most complex problems had the simplest solutions, and sometimes the most unlikely person was exactly the right person for an impossible job. Martinez disappeared into the mountain darkness, carrying with him the hopes of every soldier who had ever believed that no fortress was truly impregnable. The real test was about to begin. At 3:47 a.m., Jake Martinez reached the 7th transmission tower in the line that led to Fortress Mordain. His hands were raw from climbing, his shoulders ached from the weight of his pack, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. But he was less than half a mile from the fortress perimeter, closer than any hostile force had come in 3 years. The journey along the power line had taken 12 hours of careful movement. Martinez had traveled from tower to tower like a mountain climber moving between peaks, using the transmission lines themselves as guide ropes when the terrain became too treacherous for normal hiking. Twice he had been forced to hide motionless for over an hour while Kozlov's patrol helicopters swept the area with searchlights. But his gamble was paying off. The power line corridor was indeed a blind spot in the fortress's surveillance network. Kozlov's security systems were focused outward from the fortress, watching for forces approaching across open ground or through the obvious valley approaches. They weren't designed to detect someone moving inward along the very infrastructure that kept the fortress operational. From his position on the 7th tower, Martinez could see Fortress Mordain in unprecedented detail. The satellite images he had studied hadn't captured the true scale of Kozlov's creation. The fortress wasn't just built into the mountain, it was the mountain, carved and shaped until the natural stone had become a weapon of war. The main structure rose in terraced levels, each one bristling with defensive positions and automated weapons systems. Martinez counted at least 40 visible gun emplacements, 26 guard towers, and multiple missile launcher sites. Spotlights swept the surrounding terrain in overlapping patterns, creating a web of illumination that seemed to cover every possible approach route. But Martinez wasn't looking at the obvious defenses. His maintenance workers' eye was focused on something much more mundane, the utility connections that kept all of this sophisticated equipment operational. Every automated gun needed electrical power. Every searchlight required a control cable. Every sensor array had to be connected to a central monitoring system. And all of those connections had to be accessible for maintenance and repair. Following the power lines with his eyes, Martinez traced their path from his current position to a large transformer station built into the fortress's lower level. From there, smaller distribution lines branched out like veins, carrying electricity to every corner of Kozlov's defensive network. More importantly, he could see that the transformer station had external access panels and maintenance walkways. It was designed to be serviced by technicians who might need to work on the equipment even during periods of high security. Those maintenance areas would be the least heavily guarded parts of the entire fortress. Martinez spent the next hour studying guard rotations and patrol patterns. Kozlov's security was thorough but followed predictable schedules. Guards changed positions every 2 hours. Patrol helicopters swept the area every 90 minutes. Automated systems cycled through their scanning patterns in 12-minute intervals. The timing was tight, but there was a gap. For exactly 18 minutes every cycle, a combination of guard rotations and patrol schedules left the transformer station with minimal direct observation. It wasn't enough time for a military assault, but it might be enough time for a single person to reach the facility and get inside. At 4:15 a.m., Martinez began his final approach. He climbed down from the transmission tower and followed the power lines on foot, moving parallel to the cables but staying in the shadows cast by the massive insulators and support structures. The last quarter mile required him to crawl on his belly, using every depression in the terrain and every piece of cover to avoid the searchlights that swept back and forth across the mountainside. Twice he was forced to lie completely still as automated sensors swept past his position. The thermal imaging systems were sophisticated enough to detect body heat, but Martinez had learned from studying the failed missions that the sensors were calibrated to ignore anything smaller than a full-sized person. By pressing himself flat against the cold mountain stone and controlling his breathing, he was able to register as background heat rather than a human target. At 4:31 a.m., he reached the outer fence of the transformer station. The fence was 12 feet high and topped with razor wire, but it was designed to keep out casual intruders rather than determined infiltrators. More importantly, it had to accommodate the power lines that passed through it, creating necessary gaps in the electrical barriers that protected most of the fortress perimeter. Using wire cutters from his pack, Martinez carefully enlarged one of these gaps until it was large enough for him to squeeze through. The work took precious minutes, but he forced himself to move slowly and methodically. A single mistake here would trigger alarms that would bring the full weight of Kozlov's defenses down on his position. Inside the transformer station, Martinez found himself in an industrial maze of high-voltage equipment and control systems. Massive transformers hummed with electrical energy, their surfaces covered with warning signs in multiple languages. Control panels lined the walls, their displays showing the status of electrical systems throughout the fortress. But Martinez wasn't interested in the main equipment. He was looking for something much more specific: the emergency shutdown systems that every electrical installation was required to have. Working in darkness and using only the light from instrument displays, Martinez traced power cables and control lines until he found what he was looking for. In one corner of the facility, protected by a simple steel cabinet, were the manual disconnect switches that could shut down electrical power to different sections of the fortress. The switches were clearly labeled, showing which areas of the fortress they controlled. Martinez found switches for the main defensive batteries, the automated weapons systems, the searchlight networks, and, most importantly, the central command and control center where Kozlov coordinated his entire operation. But simply shutting off the power wouldn't be enough. Kozlov would have backup generators and emergency systems that would restore power within minutes. Martinez needed to do something that would cause permanent damage and prevent the systems from being quickly restored. This was where his improvised explosives came into play. Martinez had spent weeks learning how to create plastic explosives that looked like innocent camping supplies. The energy bars in his pack weren't food, they were carefully shaped charges designed to destroy specific types of equipment. The camping stove wasn't for cooking, it was a timer and detonator system that would trigger multiple explosions in sequence. Working quickly but carefully, Martinez placed charges at critical points throughout the transformer station. One charge on the main power distribution panel. Another on the backup control system. A third on the communication lines that connected the transformer station to the fortress command center. Each charge was small enough to avoid causing massive destruction that might injure innocent personnel, but precisely placed to cause maximum disruption to the electrical systems that kept Kozlov's defenses operational. The timer on his improvised detonator was set for 20 minutes, enough time for Martinez to reach his secondary objective, but not enough time for anyone to discover and disarm the charges. At 4:52 a.m., Martinez left the transformer station and began moving toward the fortress itself. With the defensive systems still operational, this should have been the most dangerous part of his mission. But Martinez had one final advantage that no previous assault force had possessed: he wasn't trying to fight his way into the fortress. He was trying to walk in like someone who belonged there. Kozlov's fortress employed hundreds of people: guards, technicians, cooks, maintenance workers, and administrators. Not all of them lived inside the fortress itself, many commuted daily from nearby villages or temporary housing areas. And all of them had to enter and leave the fortress through service entrances that were less heavily defended than the main gates. Martinez had identified one of these service entrances during his reconnaissance, a loading dock built into the fortress's eastern wall where trucks delivered supplies and equipment. The dock was guarded, but the guards were focused on checking vehicles and cargo rather than examining individual personnel. Moving through the pre-dawn darkness, Martinez approached the loading dock area just as a supply truck was arriving for an early morning delivery. The truck's headlights and the activity of unloading provided perfect cover for someone to approach the area without being noticed. Martinez waited until the truck was positioned at the loading dock, then simply walked out of the shadows and joined the small group of workers who were beginning to unload cargo. His work clothes and confident manner made him invisible, just another maintenance worker starting an early shift. Nobody questioned his presence. Nobody asked for identification. Nobody wondered why they hadn't seen him before. In the pre-dawn confusion of a routine supply delivery, one more worker was unremarkable. Martinez helped unload cargo for exactly 12 minutes, long enough to establish his presence and gain access to the fortress interior. Then, he quietly separated from the group and began moving through the fortress corridors like someone who had every right to be there. The interior of Fortress Mordain was as impressive as its exterior defenses. Corridors carved from living stone stretched in every direction, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows. The air was filled with the constant hum of ventilation systems and electrical equipment. But Martinez wasn't intimidated by the fortress's imposing atmosphere. He was focused on finding his primary target, Viktor Kozlov's command and control center. Using skills learned from 15 years of maintaining military facilities, Martinez followed power cables and communication lines through the fortress's mechanical spaces. He moved through utility tunnels, maintenance shafts, and equipment rooms that were largely ignored by security personnel. At 5:18 a.m., exactly 2 minutes before his charges were scheduled to detonate, Martinez found what he was looking for. The command center was located deep within the fortress, protected by multiple layers of security and blast doors. Through a ventilation grate, Martinez could see banks of monitors displaying surveillance feeds from around the fortress perimeter. At the center of the room, a man who could only be Viktor Kozlov stood before a massive tactical display, pointing to various positions while giving orders to his subordinates. Kozlov was smaller than Martinez had expected, but there was an intensity in his movements that spoke of absolute confidence and control. This was a man who had never experienced failure, who had built an empire on the belief that superior technology and careful planning could overcome any opposition. In 90 seconds, that belief was about to be shattered. Martinez used his final minute to plant his last explosive charge on the ventilation system that served the command center. The charge was small but positioned to cause maximum disruption to the center's environmental controls and communication systems. At 5:20 a.m. exactly, the charges in the transformer station detonated. The explosions weren't dramatic, more like heavy doors slamming than movie-style pyrotechnics. But their effects were immediate and catastrophic. Throughout Fortress Mordain, lights went out, computer systems shut down, and automated defenses went silent. In the command center, Kozlov's tactical display went black. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. Around the room, technicians began frantically trying to restore power and communications. "What's happening?" Kozlov shouted. "Sir, we've lost primary power to all defensive systems," one technician reported. "Backup generators are starting, but it will take several minutes to restore full power." "Then, restore it faster," Kozlov snapped. "I want full defensive capability back online immediately." But the backup generators couldn't restore what Martinez had destroyed. The carefully placed charges had damaged critical control systems that would take hours or days to repair. Fortress Mordain was still physically intact, but its ability to function as an automated death trap had been eliminated with surgical precision. In the confusion, Martinez made his final move. Using the ventilation system, he dropped down into the command center itself, landing among Kozlov's staff like an avenging angel. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Kozlov reached for his sidearm, but Martinez was faster and more experienced. When the emergency power was finally restored, Kozlov's staff found their leader unconscious on the floor and a very calm American sergeant sitting in the command chair. "Gentlemen," Martinez said politely, "I think we need to discuss terms of surrender." What followed was the most unusual ending to a military conflict in modern history. Instead of a dramatic battle or siege, Fortress Mordain was taken by negotiation. With their defensive systems disabled and their leader captured, Kozlov's forces had no choice but to accept Martinez's terms. The fortress was turned over to international authorities within 72 hours. Kozlov's weapons research was confiscated, his private army disbanded, and the man himself was extradited to face charges for crimes against humanity. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message that Martinez's success sent to military forces around the world. No fortress was truly impregnable. No defensive system was perfect. Sometimes the most sophisticated problems required the most simple solutions. When Martinez finally contacted Lieutenant Chen to report his mission's success, her first question wasn't about tactics or casualties. It was much simpler. "Jake, how did you know it would work?" His answer became the stuff of military legend. "Ma'am, I didn't know it would work. I just knew that 10,000 soldiers deserved better than surrender." In the end, the fortress that had claimed 10,000 lives was taken by a single staff sergeant with a backpack full of hardware store supplies and an unshakable belief that every complex system had simple vulnerabilities. It was a victory that redefined what was possible when conventional wisdom failed and unconventional courage stepped forward. The mountains of Eastern Europe were quiet once again, and, somewhere in the darkness, the spirits of 10,000 fallen soldiers finally found peace.